Hi everyone. It's hard to believe that another year has come and gone, so instead of my typical dedicated book review, today I'm going to be doing another best of the year video. I'll admit, in general, recap style videos aren't really my favorite style to make because I prefer to focus on a single theme for each video, usually one specific book, but I guess the end of the year is a special case since I just really enjoy reminiscing about the stuff I've read throughout the year. And I read a lot again this year. Many of my books were on audiobook, but I also went through a decent number of physical or ebook copies too. As I've mentioned before, I don't think reading large numbers of books should be a major goal in itself, and we all have to work within different time constraints, so I hope you can all just appreciate however many books you got a chance to read this year, even if that's maybe one or two books that really stuck with you. Now, most of the books I read, although not quite all, are ones I've reviewed on my channel, so I'm going to include card links in the video, just in case any of those catch your attention and you want to hear more about them in a full-length review. For this video, though, I'm going to be sticking with brief descriptions, mainly focusing on what about each book has stuck with me a while after reading. So I'm just going to jump in right now with my top 10 favorite books of the year. My year, that is. Most of these books did not come out in the calendar year 2021. In fact, I'm not sure any of them did, but that's when I read them. And I won't be ranking these from favorite to least favorite or anything like that, just mentioning them in, well, mostly the order I read them in, with probably a few swaps. The first book that I really appreciated this year was Ya Jesse's second novel, Transcendent Kingdom. I read this one while I was on my winter break last year, hanging out with my parents and siblings at the home in Indiana where I grew up, and I'm back here now for a few weeks, so this one's especially fun to think back to right now. The novel follows a neuroscience PhD student through a hodgepodge of her current experiences and memories. As she reflects on why everything happened the way it did, she asks herself questions about science and religion and explores where each of these falls a bit short in her eyes. The book's a joy to read overall and also pretty short with naturally readable language, but I was maybe most impressed with the way the narrator, Gifty, explores her family's and her own religious beliefs in a way that is critical while also fairly understanding and even admiring, where admiration is due. An even shorter one I enjoyed was Ta-Nehisi Coates's Between the World and Me. There's so much said in this almost poetic 3-hour audiobook, and deservedly it's received much attention on YouTube, blogs, and newspapers. The memoir-like book is simultaneously a message to Coates' 15-year-old son, a glimpse into Coates' own childhood, and a critical reevaluation of many experiences that affected him differently back when they first happened. It's also intensely personal, super well written, and manageable for really anyone due to its short length. Coates' assessment of society is more realistic than optimistic, but it's not despairing or pessimistic. To me, at least, it felt that he sees movement towards a better world not as a given or even necessarily as a track we're on already, but he does see it as something that we can and must work towards. Notes of a Crocodile was another one that's not too long, a novel by Taiwanese author Q Mao Jin, and one that's now considered an LGBT classic. In this literary fiction novel, the narrator recounts the experiences of herself and her misfit friends at university in Taiwan in the years right after martial law ended. Most of the time, it's difficult to piece together what's really going on with these characters emotionally because the narrator is depressed, confused, and outwardly thick-skinned, and thus she fails to fully convince us that everyone around her is really as difficult as she makes them seem. Instead, we simply end up seeing her as difficult. Probably more than any other book I read this year, Notes of a Crocodile excellently conveyed a unique mood that gave it its own distinct color or character. And while this book feels depressed, it isn't a depressing novel. Things never seem to reach a point of utter hopelessness for our main character, Latsu, even if they don't really improve a whole lot either. Everyone gets by, but we see how they struggle in different ways, and that's partly because society has rejected them for their sexuality, which is one of many themes explored in the book. Next up, James Michener's The Bridge at Andau really surprised me as I read it concurrently with the next book I'll be mentioning. It's an American journalist's in-depth account of the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, I believe. Given the time of writing in the thick of the Cold War, it's not without its biases, of course, and it's pretty shallow in any broader political analysis Michener attempts to convey, but it remains excellent for how Michener immerses us in the story. He recounts individual people's experiences living in a totalitarian society and demonstrates to us why these people would have been inspired to attempt a revolution in Budapest, and then why many would flee the country in droves when the revolution was ultimately put down by the Russian Soviets. And because it's written as investigative journalism, it's especially compelling and easy to follow for a historical read. Along with The Bridge at Andau, I also took on Anne Applebaum's longer work, Iron Curtain, which focuses more broadly on totalitarianism in Hungary, Poland, and East Germany within the time period from 1944 to 1956, leading up to the time of the Hungarian Revolution. This nonfiction book is a comprehensive historical and comparative analysis of many different dimensions of society in these three Eastern European nations, and one that I found insightful and interesting. Applebaum explores just how it happened that three countries, different in many ways, and therefore not necessarily destined to proceed down the same path to communism after World War II, nevertheless, all gradually fell in line with the Soviets. And in telling this story, she spurred my interest in learning more about these countries as well. Iron Curtain will certainly be tougher to read than Bridget Ondow for a casual historian, so just know what you're committing to before you get into this one, but if you're interested in this topic, it's one that I'd highly recommend. So then I took on Elif Batuman's much beloved and also much hated 2017 novel, The Idiot. In this seemingly mostly autobiographical novel, Batuman tells the story of Céline, a clever but clueless freshman girl at Harvard University, because really, how can you not be at least kind of clueless as a college freshman? Leaving nothing out from Céline's musings and stories, Batuman conveys a certain indescribable quality of this character that some readers found infuriatingly boring, but that others, like myself, found strangely charming. Plus, we get to take a summer trip to Hungary with Céline towards the end of the book, which fit in nicely with the themes of my other recent readings, even if only loosely so. You will not walk out of this book having learned any clear lesson or message, but for me that was maybe the point, because in spite of that, I found that this book was so far from devoid of meaning or enjoyment. Another one that really surprised me was The Lemon Tree by journalist Sandy Tolan, an exploration of two families' experiences in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. One of these families is a Jewish-Israeli family, and the other an Arab-Palestinian family, and even at their most frustrating moments, I found both families incredibly sympathetic. Author Sandy Tolan did an excellent job of putting human faces on this political conflict and allowing readers to relate deeply with both main characters, Dahlia and Bashir, but without ever letting this turn into a simple why can't we all just be friends story, which would have undermined the very real and complicated disagreements that persist to this day. Somehow this narrative manages to blend both realism and optimism in a way that ultimately acknowledges there is still much work to be done. Better yet, Tolan interweaves the historical narrative in a way that I found interesting and necessary for really understanding what was at stake in the main storyline, but while also knowing his limits, avoiding getting so caught up in the historical narrative so as to lose the main thread entirely. This book left me hungry to read more about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it was an excellent entry point for me for learning about the topic. Another favorite was Ann Patchett's novel The Dutch House, with an audiobook narrated by the one and only Tom Hanks. It's a novel that feels like it shouldn't be as enjoyable as it is, telling the story of an ordinary upper-middle-class family, or maybe just middle-class family, it's hard to say, as the two children, Danny and Maeve, grow up, become like their parents, and basically learn nothing about themselves. But the characters in this novel are just so fun to watch because Ann Patchett really gives them the space to grow, breathe, and move through life as they interact incidentally with the world and with one another. It never feels like these characters are there to blatantly represent some bigger message. They're here just to be people. And I'm not the only one who enjoyed this novel. To my surprise, almost all the YouTube videos I watched had good things to say as well, and I enjoyed it in spite of not being quite so immersed in Ann Patchett's previous novel, Commonwealth. So excellent work, Ann Patchett. The second to last of my favorites this year was a modern classic by Nobel Prize-winning author Kazuo Ishiguro. The Remains of the Day is the much-beloved tale of an English butler, Stevens, who takes a car trip across the countryside of England in a nostalgic romp that Ishiguro himself said in an interview was written with the intent to capture the texture of memory. Ishiguro succeeds in that endeavor and in creating an endearing while sometimes frustrating main character, Stevens. One of my favorite parts was that my own perceptions of Stevens' actions and values were different than those of some other YouTubers who I watch and enjoy, really underscoring the fact that this book leaves plenty of space for interpretation and introduces the sorts of questions for which there are no clear right answers. It is a slow book and not heavy on the action, which earned it a bit of criticism from others in my family book club, but I personally enjoyed it very much, and I'd recommend it if it sounds like your type of novel. And then the last of my favorite reads this year is one that I reviewed very recently, and that was C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters, recommended to me by fellow YouTuber David Gosley. It's in some sense a quick read, but one that almost demands rereading because there's so much of value to be found in this short tale that it'd be hard to digest it all on a single pass through. The premise is that a low-ranking devil in the bureaucracy of tempters is writing to his senior uncle Screwtape for advice in how to basically turn his patient, as devils call us humans, into a lousy person. This book is often funny while also being dead serious in its implications, and the real kicker is that we realize pretty soon that the devils are a lot craftier than just leading us humans into the obvious pitfalls. They instead play a longer game, one that involves, for example, making us proud of ourselves for avoiding a few obvious temptations so that we then let down our guard to future, more subtle temptations. Whether you're a Christian or not, at least some of your values will probably align with Lewis's own values, and that's why I found this book enormously valuable and would recommend it to pretty much anyone who's in the mood for a serious reflection on ethics, morality, and self-improvement. But one that's also strangely fun to read. So those were my top 10 reads for the year in no particular order, but being as good of a reading year as it was for me, I just can't help but go through a quick list of honorable mentions that I also enjoyed, many of which I reviewed on this channel and all of which I'd recommend. I read a few of Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot books this year, and my favorite one was definitely Sad Cypress, followed by The Hollow. And the reason I especially liked these books was that they both painted deeper characters than what I'm used to from Agatha Christie. I mean, they were hardly the best characters I ever read, but it was refreshing to see characters that seemed different and interesting, especially after a long string of Poirot novels featuring people that basically felt like stock characters meant to fill a particular role in a mystery and nothing more. Of these two novels, Sad Cypress was the better in terms of the overall mystery and solution, while The Hollow had the better characters, but the solution there was just a wee bit less believable or less interesting. Still good, though. And both of these two rank among, let's say, the top third of the Poirot novels. Red at the Bone by Jacqueline Woodson was also a quality read. It's a rather short story of a black family that explores various family members' perspectives on life and how they were all affected by an unexpected pregnancy. That feels like a really lousy description, and much like my description of The Dutch House, but I guess that's because this too is a novel where the main selling point is interesting characters that are relatable and feel genuinely believable. I liked it, even though it didn't stand out to me quite as much as some of the other novels I read this year. For me, the biggest downside in the end was actually its short length, which didn't give me as much time to explore the many characters' lives as I would have liked. But I know quite a few people enjoyed this one even more than I did. It's a quick read, too. It's a quick read, so worth a second look if it catches your eye. I also finally read the beloved young adult novel by Angie Thomas, The Hate U Give. Obviously, this novel's received a lot of attention, has been made into a movie by the time I read it. It's on school reading lists, not to mention banned book lists, although I'd hardly say that the portrayal of police in this book is really radical. So I finally had to see what all the buzz was about. And it's a good book, even for someone who's not in the target audience of young adults. It's a book I'd certainly recommend for teens, one that's both fun and serious, that invites critical thinking and placing ourselves in others' perspectives, including some perspectives you might not be expecting when you first start the book, and one that kept me entertained the whole way through. Another honorable mention was G.K. Chesterton's short story mystery collection, The Innocence of Father Brown, featuring a crime-solving priest. This collection, along with its successor, The Wisdom of Father Brown, contains its fair share of duds along with the really good ones, but where it shines, it's really a lot of fun. It's especially nice in that the short mysteries are digestible in small chunks instead of having to commit to a whole novel-length mystery all at once, and for that reason I'm looking forward to slowly working my way through the remaining 3 books in the Father Brown anthology. Not to mention, these first 2 of the 5 collections are in the public domain now, so you can read them on Project Gutenberg. Another memorable read was Hunger by Roxane Gay, in which the author talks about her physical and emotional struggles with being fat, and with it the closely connected story of a sexual assault she experienced as a child, and that is inextricably linked in her mind with her eating problems. It's an honest portrayal of how she's felt and how she feels to this day. She doesn't claim to have found all the answers. In fact, she often opts to give an emotional account of something that happened to her, even while acknowledging that a purely rational external actor would have viewed things somewhat differently. And this decision pretty much always feels like the right one, making this a far more vulnerable and personal account than it could have been, and one that I expect many readers will find both valuable and relatable. And then there's Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng, which I reviewed this book in the summer after I read it, and I said then how much I enjoyed it in spite of seeing certain flaws in it as a literary work. And yeah, I'm not sure what it was about this book, but I still have to say I liked it, because the good parts of it were enough to make it worth reading. I say that too as someone who really didn't enjoy Little Fires Everywhere, as I found that one was just too heavy-handed and left no room for real nuance. Everything I Never Told You, though, is, at its best moments, a poignant exploration of parent-child and sibling-sibling relationships in the high school years, and one that further integrates themes of growing up as an Asian American in a town where Asian Americans really stand out. If you're prepared for an occasional bit of cheesiness and convenient plot turns, you might give this one a shot. Then there's the one Jules Verne book I got through this year. The Adventures of Captain Hatteras was really a good one. chronicling the journey of a crazed captain and his quirky crew members on their expedition to the North Pole. This one goes a step further in character development than Verne's other books I read a year ago, without sacrificing the technical science fiction style that his readers love so much. I also learned from some commenters that in future Jules Verne reading, it might be worth picking up a more recent translation, because some of the early English translations, like the ones I found on Project Gutenberg, were poorly translated, sometimes even editing out large parts of the text. So sooner or later, I'll have to take on the next Verne adventure, Journey to the Center of the Earth. Another memorable one was Hurricane Season by Mexican author Fernanda Melchor, translated from the original Spanish version. This one is a monster of a novel that I've been meaning to review for a while, but I still just haven't been able to do it justice. Some have described it as a gothic novel or as a crime novel. I personally don't think either of these really fits, but I don't know how to describe it. It's not one to pick up lightly, though, as it's filled with pretty disturbing and grisly events and seems to really portray the worst that humanity has to offer, all before, in a weird way, it kind of comes full circle, revealing to us that maybe under certain circumstances, it's no surprise that people will end up hardened, nasty, and even just plain cruel. This one wasn't among my top 10 favorites because, well, I can't really say I liked this book as I was reading it, yet it's one of those books I can't help but appreciate as an excellent piece of literature that did what I think the author wanted it to do. And last up there was We Keep the Dead Close, which I'll be posting a review of coming very soon. An investigation by journalist turned crime investigator Becky Cooper into the 50-year-old murder case of a female graduate student in the archaeology department at Harvard. To explain why I enjoyed this book in just a few sentences is tough, but basically the author takes a tried and true formula, the true crime novel, and then kind of just undermines all the conventions of the genre. Cooper inserts herself as almost another character in the investigation and quickly moves things in a direction that redirects our interest to things other than the murder solution itself, which becomes relatively unimportant by the time we're through. It's hard to quite get it without reading the book yourself, which is a big ask because while many people, myself included, enjoyed this book overall, others found it excruciatingly boring, and even I would have to admit that the second half is slow and weaker than the first half. I'd recommend you check out what the book is about and the themes explored in it, and if it sounds interesting, I'd totally recommend giving it a read. Okay, so that is it for the best books and honorable mentions from my 2021 reading. I hope everyone had a nice year in some way or another, even if it maybe wasn't quite what you expected or hoped for this year, and wishing everyone a happy and peaceful 2022 with hopefully some great reading ahead. Leave me a comment if you have opinions on any of these books, or even better, if you have a book or books that really stole the show for you in 2021. So bye, and until next year, happy reading.